Several years ago, during a World Cup match between Germany and Great Britain, chants started to fill the stadium. From the German side, the chants were 3 World Cups, 3 World Cups. From the British side, the chants that came back were 2 World Wars, 2 World Wars. Well, the British lost that day on the pitch, so to speak, but they had the memory of winning those 2 World Wars. We have seen over the last 75, 76 years now, both the Allies and the Axis have greatly manipulated and twisted the war memory. What we're going to focus on today are factors involving the manipulation of war memory. We're going to talk about why it has occurred, how it has occurred, and in particular the dangers associated with manipulating war memory. The reasons why each of these various nations had to manipulate the war vary depending upon the nation. Let's start with our first example of the Soviet Union. Consider this. Immediately after World War II, we have the issue of Stalin's legacy confronting the Russian people. Stalin had made tactical or strategic mistakes throughout the war. That's a problem that the memory has to be manipulated to take care of. But even worse, he had murdered millions of his own people during the war. What an incredible issue that he's going to have to deal with in terms of manipulating memory. And then following Stalin, we have Khrushchev. During this time now, more information is coming out about the Jewish problem that occurred during World War II. With so many Jews killed under the Soviet Union leadership, Khrushchev had to deal with that issue. That war memory had to be taken care of. Another reason to manipulate war memory by the Soviet Union relates to the very beginning of the war in 1939. The Soviet Union was right there with Germany when Poland was invaded by both nations. They both divided that country in half. And shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union invades Finland, Romania, and the Baltic states. Why did they do this? In part to spread ideology, the spread of communism, and to steal territories from their European neighbors. If there was ever a reason to manipulate war memory, it's to do anything in your power to make sure that post-war nations don't look at you the same way they looked at Germany. The Soviet Union argued that, in fact, war memory was worthy of manipulation to the extent that the D-Day exploits of the United States and Britain were over-exaggerated. The Soviets argued they could have defeated the Germans all on their own without the successes of Normandy. In particular, just 1 month before the Normandy invasion, there were 160 German combat divisions fighting in the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. The Soviets argued all of those troops were not available for Normandy, so as a result, it should have been very easy for the US and the Brits to defeat the Germans at Normandy. In discussing all of these reasons why the Soviet Union felt the need to manipulate memory, one important fact cannot be overlooked. They lost a total of more than 10 million soldiers, just soldiers alone, in fighting the Germans and in German POW camps. They needed to portray themselves to the world as the true victims of this particular war. And that's because if there were any reparations that needed to be repaid after the war, the Soviet Union wanted to be first in that line. Another reason why memory of the war had to be manipulated was the concept of shame. Germany and Japan had committed innumerable atrocities during the war, and it was no longer a secret. Yet the United States, for geopolitical reasons, had to have Germany and Japan come back into the world community because the ever-rising threat of communism and the looming Cold War. Germany and Japan had to become allies of the United States. Another example of a country that had to manipulate memory after the war was France. Consider this. France put up very little resistance to the Germans once it was invaded in 1940. Then they needed allies 4 years later to re-invade their country to ultimately liberate them. That was humiliating to the French. And then once they had been invaded by the Germans, their nation was in essence cut in half, with the Vichy government supporting the Nazis, collaborating with the Nazis. This was a tremendous national shame. So following the war, France's pride had been decimated. They needed to work on national unity to build that pride up again. As a result, they needed a concentrated effort to manipulate war memory. France even tried to manipulate memory with regard to the D-Day invasion. From 1956 all the way through 1978, at the annual D-Day commemorations, often French officials would be aggressive or even rude towards the United States. They would try to manipulate history and argue at one particular time that the D-Day invasions would not have been as successful but for the contributions of the resistance. De Gaulle was often insulting and even boycotted one particular year. Now let's talk about how these nations began to manipulate the memory of war. One of the most basic ways was through spin. Looking at Germany and Japan, it is fascinating the tacks that they took and in fact how similar they were in many regards. For the Germans, they tried to manipulate memory by contending that in fact what they did was a preemptive war, and that because of what they did, things actually would have been much worse if they had not started the war the way that they did. For the Japanese, they likewise tried to put a positive spin on it to the extent that they were forced into it. This was an economic decision for them. They had no choice but to attack because of economics. How the Japanese manipulated the memory of war related to shifting narratives. One of the things that they wanted to do, of course, was ignore their own history. Rather, they wanted to immediately after the war build shrines and memorials to the sacrifices that their soldiers had made for their country. They had no mention of the horrors and atrocities and bloodshed that the Japanese themselves were responsible for. They would argue that in fact they were the real victims of this war, referring to the fire bombings by the United States of their cities or what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How Japan manipulated the war was a focal, shifting narrative, making themselves the real victims. How the Germans manipulated war memory was actually even more bold and audacious than the Japanese. The Germans, of course, portrayed themselves as victims too, but here was their unique spin. They were actually victims of Hitler also. He tricked them, he manipulated them, the Germans argued. So as a result, when VE Day comes, May 8th, 1945, and celebrations on it thereafter, the Germans argue, hey, this is a celebration for us too, because we were freed from Hitler at that time. Another way how war memory has been manipulated is through the heavy use of politics. Consider, immediately after World War II, the United States realizes that the spread of communism and the impending Cold War is going to be essential to fight. German and Japanese individuals and their nations have to be seen particularly favorably by the United States. How in the world can that be accomplished? Well, quickly MacArthur comes to the decision he is not going to try Hirohito on any war crimes. Then, by 1958, all Japanese war criminals have been given clemency. They are all out of prison by that time. Now also consider this. With the Cold War looming, the United States makes the decision to allow German scientists who were in fact war criminals during the war to emigrate to the United States to help out in the Cold War. American politics was quite often used to manipulate memory of the war. Think of Pearl Harbor. Immediately after the war, those who were allies of FDR argued that this happened specifically because his enemies, the isolationists, were asleep at the switch. If people had just listened to FDR, this would not have happened, they argued. On the other side of the coin, people who were opposed to FDR argued that it was very suspicious that the carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. FDR couldn't be trusted in this regard, they would argue. Pearl Harbor became a political football for decades after the war. Even Admiral Kimmel, who was accused of culpability for the attack, had his family fighting for him for decades. Conservatives rallied behind Admiral Kimmel in this particular regard. Politics became a big weapon when it came to manipulating war memory. In terms of the success of these nations in manipulating war memory, it's been mixed. For the United States, it was generally favorable. Germany and Japan are now seen as loyal allies with very high favorability ratings. With regard to Russia, his efforts at manipulating war memory have in fact failed miserably. The people of Russia could care less. With regard to Germany, it's somewhat a little bit surprising. They now take the position we've done our penance, those were crimes committed by our grandfathers, and we're really done with World War II responsibility. Perhaps for that reason alone, it shows how the manipulation of war memory must be watched very carefully.